Broadcasting from Salisbury University campus, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7, putting Delmarva first. Stay tuned for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
In 1892, a doctor in Millington was murdered. 8 African Americans were convicted of the crime. 4 of them were hanged. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. It was a time of Jim Crow and lynchings, and Kevin Hemstock has written about it in his new book entitled Injustice on the Eastern Shore, Race and the Hill Murder Trial. In the book, he explores how the authorities and the white and African American communities reacted as the case went to trial. Lynching was avoided, but was a concern, and the book comes at a time when the state of Maryland has authorized a Truth and Reconciliation Commission on lynchings in the state. And we have Kevin on the phone this morning. Welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about it.
So describe the town of Millington at the time. What kind of town was it? What kind of race relations did it have?
We're looking at a town of about 400 people. It was like the center of a farming community, so it actually drew a lot of business because the farmers would come here to do their shopping and that kind of thing. So it was primarily white. It had been incorporated in 1890, just 2 years before the murder. And one of the reasons it was incorporated was so that they could hire policemen and that kind of thing. And one of their big concerns was black on white crime, which really wasn't that serious, but it was to the white folks here. And they incorporated in such a manner as to exclude black communities. There was a little black community, abutting on the side of the town, and they intentionally excluded that in their incorporation, so that it would basically be predominantly a white town. So it's kind of unfortunate that they did that. To this day, that community still exists. It's called Sandfield, and it's still predominantly black, and it still is not part of town officially.
What kind of relationship did the white and African American community have? I think you note in your book that the Justice of the Peace, William Johnson, was no friend to African Americans. What was that relationship like? Because obviously they did have interaction in terms of business, in terms of doing things in terms of business.
Sure they did, and it's sort of a parallel societies, and I like to say that it's like everybody knew their proper place. Does that make sense? And nobody stepped out of line in theory. Blacks didn't really shop at white stores and vice versa. There's a caveat there that's interesting, but that's probably another story. But in any case, everybody knew what their proper place was. It doesn't mean that blacks didn't work in town. I mean, there were a lot of laborers, and of course the suspects in this case were just what they called peach pickers, and they would labor on the white farms primarily. So I mean, it was just an understood relationship that you didn't step out of bounds.
Now, the incident that seems to spark everything is this collection of a debt in 1891. Describe for me the individuals involved and the altercation that resulted in one death.
Well, we had a black man from Sandfield, which was that abutting community, who hired a white man to do some carpentry work, and the white guy wanted his money. And he wanted his money right away. Well, the black man, John Potts, thought that he could pay over time, in installments, because he didn't have a lot of money. And it just grew into a confrontation at a bar on Christmas Eve, 1891. And the Potts, John Potts and his brother got some friends, including a guy named Campbell, and they went to the bar where the carpenter was playing cards with his buddies. Everybody knew this was going to happen. And it turned into a confrontation, and this guy Campbell was essentially murdered by the whites that were there playing cards. And that's all well good. That's fine. So there was an inquest, and Dr. Hill, who was later the murder victim, he judged that this guy. He claimed this guy died of a heart attack. Well, that's absurd. Of course, they kicked him to death. Is what they did. And the black community was incensed, and it led to that, that fateful night on April 23rd, 1892, where Dr. James High Hill was attacked by 8 or 9 black men and boys, and from there, that's how it all got rolling.
By the way, is there
2 murders? Yeah. You're looking at 2 murders.
Yeah, I mean, is there any indication as to what Hill's relationship was to the African American community at any time, or?
Well, interestingly enough, Hill was he would actually serve the black community as well as the white, and that wasn't, that didn't happen all the time. Some doctors just refused to work. White doctors refused to work on, blacks. But so he would help blacks, and that's fine. So he had prior to the incident at the bar, Christmas Eve, 1891, he had a pretty good relationship with the blacks.
So then, describe for me the events that occur on April 23rd, 1892, when James Hill gets a message apparently from James Shaw's daughter that she's sick. Describe for me then what happened. Okay,
well, Dr. Hill was attending a political rally because it was we were going through the campaign of Grover Cleveland for president, and he was a supporter, and they had a rally at across from Hill's residence. And while he was at the rally, his assistant, came to him and said, that the Shaws need your help up here in Massey. Of course, Massey was 4 miles north of Millington. And, back then, doctors made house calls, of course, and so sure enough, he, loaded up his what they called a dog cart, which is a 2-wheeled, passenger wagon. And he started for Massey to go visit the Shaw family. And he got about 3/4 of a mile north of Millington, where he was met by 8 or 9 black men and boys. And these black kids and men held him responsible for basically lying on the autopsy. They felt he lied on the autopsy. I'm convinced he did lie on the autopsy personally, but I couldn't find that smoking gun, as it were. But and they stopped him and grabbed him and pummeled him with a large rock, hit him in the head multiple times, and made him unconscious. And then they spooked the horse, and the horse went all the way to Massey. The horse actually went where he was supposed to go, and then stopped there and rested for a little while and turned around and came back. And about 3 o'clock in the morning, the horse ended up, at his house, and his wife found him out there, kind of scrunched into this dog cart, oddly, because the suspects had just, really manipulated his body into this cart so that he wouldn't fall out. And, his wife saw that. She went crazy, notified the neighbors, and then they summoned the doctors, but they didn't do any good. He never regained consciousness, and he died later that next day, which is a Sunday, April 23rd, or excuse me, make sure I don't get my dates wrong, April 24th, excuse me. He died on April 24th. So.
Now, one of the key figure in all of this, it seems to be, is Fletcher Williams. And Chuck Brooks obviously participated in what appears to be at least the wounds that were inflicted that led to Hill's death. Tell me a little bit about that relationship. What happened that night in terms of what Williams did and where the others were in relationship to what was going on?
Well, you essentially had 3 adults there. You had Fletcher Williams, Mosley Brown, and Charles Brooks. And these other kids were just kind of in the wrong place at the wrong time. They're just kind of hanging out. They probably didn't expect any of this sort of thing to happen. They probably didn't know it. They were just basically out hanging out with these adults. And these 3, it would seem, knew that Hill was going to the Shaws, and that's because they'd been spying on him that day. And one of them, John Potts, who was never convicted, by the way, had been seen peeking through the window at that political rally, and may have heard, Hill's assistant tell him that the Shaws needed. So consequently, they knew that somehow that Hill was going to be going north of Massey. We're talking about 9 o'clock at night. It's amazing that they were there at the same time. So we know pretty much that they knew that he was coming. So the 3 adults probably, made this all go down. The other 5, basically the kids, the teenagers, I don't think they knew what was going to happen. and they were just under pressure from the adults to participate. And they even, at the time of the assault, the three adults, told the others to do something so that they would be invested in this homicide. And so consequently, that's how they got involved.
So how did they come about that the authorities, after sort of tracking up and down, trying to figure out what happened in terms of certainly the route that Hill took, how did they come to the conclusion that these were the people who had committed the murder?
Well, the Justice of the Peace in town was William Johnson. In fact, it was his office where they had the political rally. Anyway, on the morning that Hill was still being tended by the doctors, William Johnson and another man followed. They could see the tracks of the cart. They could see where the assault took place, and they just followed the tracks all the way to Madison. They could see blood, things like that. Well, on the way, at some point, they even ran into Fletcher Williams. I think it was Fletcher Williams, and he had a hat. He had Hill's hat, and that kind of, they came back, and a couple others followed the tracks and did some stuff. And of course, at that point, the sheriff was involved, and so consequently, they had Fletcher Williams. They were looking at him, and then they came across some of his friends who were also involved, and then they came across Perry Bradshaw. I think it was Perry Bradshaw or Baynard, who someone else had said he told them about this fight that took place. And so one thing led to another where they got the group of suspects. And actually, when it was all said and done, they probably had about 20 suspects that they rounded up. And that's because some knew things that, some were being cagey. And they, ultimately, good police work, even back in 1892, they worked on these 9 suspects and finally got the story. They got the one of them turned state's evidence, and that was Perry Bradshaw. And so he wasn't charged. He was involved, but he wasn't charged. So that's our ninth guy that was involved there. And they think that John Potts was involved, but they could never place him at the scene. So out of the 8 or 9 or 10 of them, they ultimately charged 8 of them.
So one of the things that struck me is that there was a great concern after their arrest that there could be a possible lynching. Describe the efforts that were made and the fact that they were sort of coming off in many ways of 2 recent lynchings. Well,
it was pretty wild stuff there. Obviously the white community was incensed. You had, these just, to them, they were low-life laborers who killed a prominent young happy doctor. The doctor just, his wife had just had a baby. So there was just a lot of, emotion going on in the predominant white community. And so needless to say, that era it was not uncommon for lynchings to take place. Now there was only one lynching in Kent County that I've ever found. But there were a couple in Queen Anne's County, which is, the county on the south side. There's the one in Cecil County. I mean, they were going on during this period, and so there was that kind of sentiment. And in fact, the sheriff got word that a crowd was going to come to jail, one night soon after these arrests, and lynch the parties involved. And so he actually spirited away a couple of the suspects, the adult suspects, because he thought, a lynching was imminent. And sure enough, a crowd of whites, angry white farmer types and that kind of thing showed up with, blazing firebrands and pitchforks and the whole bit, and got into the jail. They were actually allowed to come into the jail because the suspects were not there. And so they went through the jail looking for them, decided, that they weren't there. And so they were, the lynching was, it didn't happen. But there was a lot of passion. Ironically, the murder was in April. The following month, there was another crime where a black man was, charged with rape of a little white girl. He was put in the jail with these suspects, and that did lead to a lynching. He was hauled out of there and hung across the street. Had nothing at all to do with this murder, but you can see the passion and the anger it was the community was under, and so consequently, there was a lynching there. When this other guy was lynched, they actually took some of the Hill suspects and got them out of there because they thought that they might be confused with the guy who was charged with rape. So, I mean, it was just a boiling cauldron of anger and on both sides of the racial spectrum. The African American community was they were concerned that this would put a bad light on them. They actually some of the local black leaders declared that they would have nothing to do with the suspects in this case. I mean, it was just talk about a racial quagmire. This was it right here.
Yeah, it was really interesting because they sort of issued this statement, which includes that they applauded the fact that there wasn't a lynching amongst other things, but at the same time, they seem to be trying to create this distance between themselves and the alleged perpetrators.
Sure, and that really shouldn't be surprising, whatever the race is. You don't want to, if you're a church-going community, you don't want to be associated with a heinous crime. And white or black, I mean, it doesn't matter what color you are. So it's not surprising, and it's just it was an unfortunate period of time when it would be difficult for any blacks accused of any crime to get a decent trial. You got to remember there were no black juries, there were no black judges, there was no black law enforcement. I mean, it was all white, and you couldn't bypass the racial bias. You just couldn't, no matter what. And so there was just a lot of racial tension.
So, in terms of the situation with these defendants, one of the things that did happen was that John Potts, in the end, was let go. What was the reaction to that, and why was it they were not able to connect him to this particular murder?
Well, John and his brother, they couldn't place either one of them at the crime scene, which was the assault, and they just couldn't. And the guy who turned state's evidence, Perry Bradshaw, he didn't place Potts at the crime scene. Now, clearly, Potts was. I shouldn't say clearly, but one witness said they saw Potts watching Hill when he was at that political rally. But that doesn't mean he committed crime. And so, needless to say, the white community was still incensed that Potts got off. Now, as soon as Potts was acquitted, the judge and the sheriff helped him get a ticket the heck out of the community because they thought he was going to be lynched too. And I think I found a later reference to him in the 1900 census, but I'm not 100% sure. It was a reasonably common name, but I think he moved to Philadelphia ultimately.
So what were the confessions that then really kind of nailed this into the coffin in terms of the trial that was submitted and how people knew what was going on? What were the key confessions here? Perry
Bradshaw he turned state's evidence, and Josh Baynard also, he lied and kind of, quibbled on some of the aspects, but he also gave the sheriff a lot of evidence, and as a consequence, they were able to piece the story together from other witness accounts as well, and so that's really what it did. Perry Bradshaw is interesting because, needless to say, he was never charged, and they, he eventually did leave the area too. But the irony is when this book was first published, I had somebody come into the little shop I had where I used to sell antiques, and he was a wonderful African American man, and he slammed the book down on the counter, and I thought, uh-oh, we've got a problem here. And he looked up at me and he said, "This is the second best book I've ever read." He said, the first being the Bible. He said, because Perry Bradshaw was my ancestor, and you got everything right about the account, about his genealogy and all that stuff like that. And so I thought that was pretty interesting. And of course, the book's already published, but he gave me a lot more information. Actually I had some interesting pictures from him. But, so it's kind of gratifying when that happens, when someone, he was a descendant of one of the perpetrators, and he thought it was a great representation of what went on and what he knew about.
So in terms of the defendants as they were going through this trial process, what was their demeanor like? And you seem to indicate that at least particularly the younger ones did not necessarily have a full grasp of what was taking place in front of them.
They didn't understand the process. They didn't understand the legal process. They really didn't understand their crime or what they were being charged with, and they certainly didn't understand what the ultimate penalty would be if they were found guilty. It's like when the judge issued the verdict. There were three judges actually, and then the chief judge issued the verdict. They really didn't understand it, and of course the adults did. They knew it was probably the end of their lives. They were going to hang for it. So consequently, the youngsters. I think one of them might have been Frisbee Comedies, said, "Okay, so when are we going to go home now?" There was no way he could grasp that, and I don't know whether it was an intelligence issue on his part or just a misunderstanding of, the system, as it were. You got to remember, area blacks avoided the legal system because it was a white-driven system. They didn't trust it. Their system was church-driven. That's where, they did a lot of their business and they, stayed within the confines of their community, and they didn't trust and they didn't understand the white legal system or anything that went along with it. So unless they had to be involved in it for one reason or the other, maybe to get a license or to do something or whatever, get a permit or something, a building permit or whatever it might have been, that's the only time they would get involved in that system. And so consequently, there was just a lack of understanding about what all of this meant. The truth of it is, back then, I don't know if you caught this, but, if you were convicted of first-degree murder, there was only one sentence. The judges didn't have any option. The sentence was death, unless it was commuted by the governor. In this particular case, all 8 alleged perpetrators were sentenced to death, and the governor, of course, Governor Farmer Brown, he commuted the sentence of the 4 youngest ones, and commuted it to life in prison. Of course, I'm sure you noted that that life didn't last very long in prison. But,
about 7 years.
Prison wasn't a nice place for certainly not for teenagers.
So, speaking of the governor, as a matter of fact, because he makes a surprise visit. Tell me about the visit, and then ultimately the rationale for why he decided to make those 4 in particular commuted to life.
Well, I think the governor had a lot of integrity, and you always hear about politicians in that era being crooked, but I think that's why this guy here, Governor Brown, he had have a lot of integrity. He only served one term, which may be because they had a lot of integrity. I'm just saying, but he really toiled over this. There's a lot of hand-wringing over this case because he was getting communication from African American leaders in Baltimore. He actually got communication from the wife of Dr. Hill, telling him that, well, these guys have been charged, convicted, and sentenced, and that shouldn't be changed because it was a strong move to get the young ones, give them a life sentence versus death. And at that, there was a point at which he decided he was going to come to town himself. You got to understand, we don't see the governor in Kent County very often. So even back then, it was quite a shock when he showed up at the sheriff's house, and the sheriff and the jail, they were connected. So you can imagine his shock when he knocked on the door and said, "I want to talk to these. Younger ones, or talk to all." He talked to all of them, and he decided ultimately that 4 of them should have commuted sentences, the youngest ones. Now, the one that he did, his sentence he didn't commute, who was also very young, was Frisbee Comedies, and I got from that in his interview of Comedies that he just got a bad vibe. For some reason, Comedies was a smart aleck or something like that, and because Comedies was just as young as the other 4 youngsters, and maybe even younger. I think he's like 14 or 15. But so that the governor just got a bad vibe with him, so he got stuck with the adults in in the capital punishment.
Now, tell me, describe for a minute about the hanging. And one of the things that struck me, and I did not realize this, was that these hangings, they took, and the executions for that matter, took place actually in the localities where these events occur. It wasn't until later, actually, that they moved them to the penitentiary. Tell me a little bit about this, because it's almost a certain circus quality to this event.
Yeah, and it's always been so since the dawn of English law. The public, governments have thought that the public needs to see it, to see that justice has been done. By the time that these guys were hanged, these four were hanged, they wanted to make sure the public knew that they were hanged to get executed and punished for their crimes, but they didn't want the public to be close enough that they could see it and see the grisly action. So they actually made a good effort to try to obscure the hanging site. It was outside the courthouse, but they built a fence around the property, and then they built a little kind of obscuring wooden screen kind of thing to actually prevent people from actually seeing the hanging. You can imagine, of course, the scaffolding was built for 8 because the sheriff didn't know until towards the end that that 4 would be commuted. So it's pretty big scaffolding, and but still in all, it was a four person hanging, pretty spectacular from the sensation side. And even though the weather was awful, I mean, it was January 13th, Friday the 13th, by the way, that this hanging took place. It was snowy, it was cold, but there were still a lot of people showed up, and I don't know whether you'd say it was hundreds or thousands, who knows, but hanging was supposed to take place at noon, so it was a little late, so people were getting anxious, and some of the rowdier members of the crowd started to bust through the fence, and some of them actually got into the yard, and when the hanging took place, there was actually people touching the bodies and the hanging bodies and stuff. It was a grisly affair. It wasn't a pretty hanging. Hangings generally wouldn't be anyway, but this one was particularly awful because Frisbee Comegys didn't die right away, and he, if you can imagine, he danced around under the rope for probably 5-10 minutes, and you can imagine that was a million lifetimes for that poor kid. So it was just not a pretty thing.
Now, one of the things, by the way, that struck me is that despite all of the confessions and so on, that when they were asked, particularly by the governor, did you do it, they all seemed to be saying, or most of them anyways, to me saying, deny that they did it and that they were innocent. What are we to make of that?
Well, in fact, the last word that was said by these suspects was that you're hanging an innocent man. But I wasn't surprised by that because I studied some other executions, and one of the most famous ones in Kent County was the Cosder murder in 1851, and right up to the end, those 3 suspects said the same thing. They were innocent, and they wouldn't do anything, and so I'm not sure. I guess who knows what goes through the mind of someone who has to face that kind of penalty in terms of whether they want to, say what they did, what their part was in a case like this or not, or whether they figure going to die anyway, might as well go shouting my innocence. Bottom line is they never did say, other than the one there was that Josh Baird. He's the one that said that, or Boehner, excuse me. He's the one that did actually give some information, but he did also lie about some of the aspects of it. So, but the others, by and large, did not confess.
Finally, you actually explored some legal questions about the trial. Tell me a little bit about those, and the fact that these 2 defense attorneys didn't do some of the things that, as we look back now anyway, that would be done.
Well, they were white attorneys in the lawyer club in Kent County at the time. Basically, they were prominent attorneys, and they were put on the case to mollify the white community, essentially. I talked to modern-day lawyers, and it's interesting to note that, this case here, it's like you would never ever try nine people or 9 people in one trial for murder. I mean, that wouldn't happen. That would be considered malpractice, legal malpractice. So, I mean, there was just a lot of things in this that's, hence the word injustice, and that's where the word injustice comes. In this day and age, those 5 kids would never have been convicted of murder. Maybe manslaughter for their involvement or whatever, but they would never have been convicted. They would never have been, certainly never been hanged in the case of Frisbee Comedy. So that's part of the issue there. For that period, a black man could not get a good, well represented in that community, in that kind of environment. It's just impossible. And so, hence the word injustice. There's no doubt that the three adults were involved in this crime. I think the kids, they were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were hanging out with what they probably thought were cool adults, and they just happened to be there when it happened. So, anyway, that's the sad part. Hopefully, that's changed a little bit. We hear many of modern day cases that are questionable, but certainly that would never have happened, and there would have been changes of venue, I'm sure, in some of these cases. No question about it. And sometimes that happened. You look at the Cosden murder, the 1851 Cosden murder, and there was a change of venue in 2 of the cases. Well, that should have happened here as well. And because obviously the community was so incensed, we really couldn't have gotten a fair trial. Needless to say, there were no blacks on the jury. Blacks were not chosen for the jury, any jury. No women on the jury, of course. Women were also excluded from juries. And so, the bottom line is, from a justice standpoint, there was no justice. It wasn't properly done by today's standards.
We've been speaking with Kevin Hemstock. He has written about this murder of James Hill, the doctor, and his book entitled Injustice on the Eastern Shore, Race and the Hill Murder Trial. We appreciate you taking the time to speak with us this morning.
Well, I appreciate you having me, and I hope you enjoyed the book.
No, it was fascinating.
Yeah, very good.
You've been listening to Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush, and thanks for listening.